Everybody, welcome to What's Up Wednesday. I want to talk a little bit this week about the topic of ergonomics. Now, ergonomics has long been kind of a bad word in the safety industry, so to speak. And I remember going back 25 years now, around 2000, there was rumor that OSHA was going to pass an ergonomic standard. And I know that it affected us in Washington State when I was working in consulting and sales. There was this rumor that Washington State was going to get out in front of OSHA and create a policy or a program or a ruling around ergonomic programs. So I saw a very significant reaction by industry to try to implement some different ergonomic programs in order to kind of get ahead and make it a little bit easier to comply once these standards were passed. Now, inevitably, OSHA did not enact an ergonomic standard, and the state of Washington didn't either. But, ergonomics kind of falls under the general duty clause in a lot of ways. And, the reality is this: ergonomics, or I would say ergonomic issues and challenges, often lead to musculoskeletal disorders and injuries, also called soft tissue injuries, repetitive motion disorders. But the reality is many times these injuries and illnesses are chronic, meaning they occur over an extended period of time. It's not an acute incident such as hitting your thumb with a hammer, falling off of a ladder. Those are instantaneous injuries that you know exactly when they happened. Your MSDs, musculoskeletal disorders, tend to occur over many years of doing repetitive type of work, whether it's typing on a keyboard, whether it's working overhead, installing parts on airplanes, any kind of manual repetitive type of work. And I think that as employers, we have to really look at this issue regardless of a standard, because on average, the direct cost of workers' compensation claims from kind of chronic MSDs is over $20 billion a year in the United States. And that's just the direct cost of claims. When we look at the indirect cost of lost productivity, retraining, all the other things, that result from people being out hurt with MSDs or being on restricted duty or having limitations, you're talking another 60 to 80 billion dollars in the United States every year. So we're talking about a significant problem. And the reality is this: is that long-term chronic injuries and illnesses tend to be, not even tend to, they account for the highest percentage of workers' compensation claims costs in the United States every single year. So when we think about it, it's a really, really big issue. And I think it's important that from a very proactive standpoint, that employers are looking at ways to do things. So I'll go back to a story I've shared in the past. When I was initially going to college before I found the safety profession, I was working as a union laborer kind of in between quarters to make some money. And at that time, we're talking early 1990s, laborers were somewhat disposable. I think that many employers understood the cost of workers' comp claims, but to an extent, laborers were still disposable, meaning that if you didn't like the labor you had, or they started complaining or dragging or lagging a little bit, you just send them back to the hall and you order a new one. And I remember one day showing up on a project to do, I think it was a gas line replacement on a major roadway in Bellevue, Washington. And I showed up where I was dispatched early in the morning, and the superintendent for the crew came over to me and he kind of gave me a quick orientation. There's a compressor right there. It was a trailer compressor. There's plenty of airline inside, and there's a 90-pound jackhammer inside. You see those two lines going down the road? And I looked, and there were two white lines as far as I could see going up and curving around to the right. And he said, start cutting. I spent 3 days running a 90-pound jackhammer, 8 hours a day. No anti-vibration gloves, nothing. By the end of 3 days, to say the least, I was hurting. I was not work hardened to run a jackhammer all day long, something that big and heavy. and it beat the crud out of me. And then they were done with me. They just needed me to do that task, and they sent me back to the hall, and I ended up going back out to another contractor, I think, to do some work. But ultimately, how do they do that work today? Well, they learned their lesson. And why did they learn their lesson? They learned their lesson because they had a bunch of injury claims over time from that type of work, where people started filing claims for carpal tunnel and different tendon related issues because they beat the crap out of themselves. So now they use a wheel loader, and they have a big saw on the front of it. They take the bucket off, they put a big saw cutting device on it, and they basically lower that saw into the asphalt, and the wheel loader drives forward and cuts those lines, and an excavator comes in and clears the asphalt out, digs the excavation so they can do the work. They don't have to abuse a labor to do that work anymore. It's a lot more efficient. There's no injury. They don't have any labor to do the actual work because it's being done with a machine. So in a lot of ways, there is an example of a significant ergonomic improvement. And when we look at ergonomics, I think we look at two components of it. One is the workstation and whether that workstation is designed to the individual worker. And then the other would be task specific work. And there's a lot more to this. I'm oversimplifying it. But when we look at a workstation, and I used to do ergo assessments when I worked for a county, not everybody is the same height, the same weight, has the same body mechanics. So really, we have to look at each individual workstation. If somebody's in a fixed type of a workstation, and we need to design that workstation to them specifically. We want to make sure that all of their body mechanics are in a neutral position so that they're at lower risk of having a cumulative trauma, repetitive motion type of MSD. The other component of ergo, and I know that this really applies to manufacturing and construction, is repetitive motion of different types of tasks. So a good example would be in construction, installing drywall overhead, or doing a lot of mechanical work, HVAC and plumbing and electrical, where you're working overhead. I know in manufacturing and aerospace, doing a lot of work overhead, manufacturing and assembling airplanes is a really good example. And I know that we had a little bit of experience doing some evaluation and training around exoskeleton programs for overhead work. And that technology is coming. I think there's still challenges to it, but it's a proactive effort to try to solve a problem related to a task or a workstation. And I think it's really critical when we are walking in the work environment that we kind of belong to, that we're looking at those things. We're looking at how the workstation is designed around the worker, or how the worker performs tasks, and where the risk may lie for a long-term MSD. So think about that a little bit, do a little research on ergo, and bring it up with people, because I think one of the greatest tools we have is our people in the field. Ask them what they're seeing, ask them what their concerns are, ask them to show us how they do their work, and maybe even better ideas they have of how to improve it and reduce risk. I think these are things that are really critical in our role in safety leadership. And eventually, we're going to have an ergo standard that is very specific on what we have to do. But if we get out in front of it now, and we're constantly looking at these things, and I think a lot of employers are, I think we're going to come out ahead. So hopefully that's helpful. We'll see you next Wednesday.